So I'm Deputy Catherine Curtis, the chair of the panel.
My name is Mark Labby, Connétable of Greville. I'm the vice chair of this panel.
And I am Deputy Poray, and I'm a panel member.
Deputy Rob Ward, Minister for Education and Lifelong Learning.
Sean O'Regan, Group Director of Education.
Anne Homer, Head of Finance, Business Partnering, Supporting SIPES.
Jonathan Williams, Programme Director for Education Reform.
Okay, thank you everyone. We've got 1.5 hours for this hearing. So I've got the first questions and we have to go back in time a little bit, seeing as this is a review of education funding. So firstly, if we just go back before your tenure, Minister, and look at the reviews in the past 3 to 4 years, we understand that the Education Reform Programme was established in response to the Independent School Funding Review and the Big Education Conversation from 2020. So can you describe what the Education Reform Programme has focused on with regards to secondary education in Jersey since then?
I think there have been a number of areas in terms of the Education Reform Programme. One of them was the funding model itself, because there was recognised in that review that there was a shortfall of around £5.5 million in school funding. And there was repeated years where schools simply could not reach the end of the year without an overspend and just maintain where they are. And I think it's a really important point to make. All they were doing was maintaining their standard set. There wasn't anything new going on. So that was addressed during that reform programme. There is an ongoing set of education reforms that came from it as well, in terms of terms and conditions, in terms of hours, in terms of roles, which there's a lot of consultation going on, but they're ongoing now. The main change that came from that at the moment is the reform to the funding mechanism for schools. And that was a move away from the ALPU, the average weighted pupil unit, to a more sort of, one might say complex, but more refined system of funding, which took account of other areas. And I'm sure we'll get some questions on those.
Yeah. So you mentioned the funding shortfall, that it wasn't really looking at new developments at the time, and since then there's been ongoing reforms and a move away to a more holistic, I suppose, not, more complex funding formula. So has it actually delivered these points, do you think, for secondary education?
It certainly delivered a change to the funding mechanism. So the funding mechanism now is more, I think it's more targeted to need, certainly. And it's separated up simply from funding per pupil to funding, well, a combination of factors, which I made a load of notes on in my folder, which I'll get out in a moment, but I can remember it off the top of my head. So that's, if you like, funding for classes, a small amount, a smaller focus on the number of pupils, funding for areas such as SEN, for a record of need, and they are different things, but that gap between those that are special educational needs identified but not entirely on a record of need, which is a deeper need. So it's recognised those. Also, and there are 2 other areas which I have written down in terms of the funding formula, which is richer. But the one point I would make, and I think one of the important points, is that what it gave is more security for schools in terms of their funding. Because with the average weighted pupil unit, the ALPU, losing students or student fluctuating numbers could have a significant effect on the funding amount. Whereas funding classes, and the example I've got, if I take a second to explain it the way I see it, and I'll make these figures up just so that I can add them up in my head, which is good. If you had 10 classes of 25 students, if you lost 10 students from that with the ALPU, you lost 10 sets of funding. That could be a significant amount of money. With the model that we have now, only a small proportion is set on the number of students, but it's more a number of classes. So if you lose 10 students, you still have 24 per class. You can't lose a teacher, and you don't have to lose a teacher with the model that we have now. If you lose 20 students, where previously you may have had to lose a class and a massive increase in sizes, again, you don't have to do that because that impact isn't as significant. But there are also other layers that go on top of the funding, which are really important. If I can just get my pad out, because I made some significant notes, but go on, I've got it now.
Yeah, well, this might go into the next question about it, which is what are the future objectives as well for the education reform programme? So again, you know, what's still developing.
In terms of funding, I think one of the things that we have to do is a bit of refinement of where we are. So, for example, the other areas around the funding is in around lower prior attainment. So there is a set amount regards lower prior attainment. Now that recognises all students from wherever their background is, if they had a lower prior attainment for whatever reason. So they may need greater support in schools in order to move forward, to get to a level where we want them to be. Yes. There's an amount put for multilingual learners across all schools that's shared between them. And there's also obviously the Jersey Premium. And Jersey Premium is something I think that is having an impact on the effect of socioeconomic disadvantage on outcomes in schools. And I think we're starting to see that. But I would say that, 10 years really it takes for Jersey Premium to impact? That's the evidence that came from the UK to really impact. Yeah. And it's been going for, 4 years or 5?
Well, we piloted in 2016 and then started to roll out.
So a bit longer than that. So we are starting to see some benefits from that. So those are the areas, and I think it is about refinement and seeing those changes embed.
So the future objectives is about building on
what absolutely.
You've already, okay.
But also the work that's going on in the wider context of the education reform programme and those discussions in terms of wider issues of schools such as PPA, which is planning time, contracts, the way that SA points perhaps are distributed, what schools actually want to do. But that's done in consultation with staff.
That's planning time. Sorry, what was the other thing you mentioned?
I remember what I just said. SA points, so responsibility points, and whether there wants to be a change in the way that they may be allocated or seen.
Oh yes, I know. Okay. Yeah. So
I refer to them as SA
this is
points,
when some members of staff might be paid extra for the extra responsibilities.
Certain responsibilities, such as a head of department or a
Head of house.
Head of house, that type of thing. Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So the next question is the Independent School Funding Review, which came out in 2020, had several headline recommendations. I just was having a look at them again, like stronger governance, uplift to the Jersey Premium, quite a few different things like that. So can you explain how those recommendations have been addressed?
Yeah, the Jersey Premium uplift I'll address first of all, because that is something I've been very interested in where that's gone. We're currently at a stage where we're just about equal to the UK, but we have a slightly different approach to it. In the UK, Jersey Premium simply follows the number of students. It is set, and if you have 100 students will get that amount. If you have 150, you'll get that amount for 150. We have a set amount that is distributed for Jersey Premium. So the reality is, if there are more students, that pupil premium amount will be less. Now, I think the way to solve that, and I'll state this in this public hearing, which I think is a useful thing to do, is to have that as, what's the phrase that I'm looking for? The
Annually managed expenditure.
Annually managed expenditures, like social security. So if more people apply for social security, that money is available because it is recognised that they are fluctuating numbers. I think if we can adopt that for pupil premium, it will be much more flexible for us. Yeah. At the moment, we seem to be okay. Because pupil premium seems to be working and the numbers are not fluctuating wildly, I believe. And so the amount set has got us virtually to, and I can tell you the figures, to where, for example, the comparison with the UK, in primary in the UK, it's 1,490, we're 1,480, so it is very close. Secondary, 1,060, here 1,050, so we're about £10-20 out in most areas, so it is very close. But if there was a larger increase in those qualifying for pupil premium at the moment, it would probably go down. So that's one of the things we need to look at, a solution to. May not be a problem, but if it is, let's be proactive in terms of solving that before it does arise.
Okay.
because it's having a positive impact.
Yeah, and with that independent school funding review, that was one of the headline recommendations.
Yeah.
Was there anything else particular from that, which is still having an impact or still needs addressing, do you think?
Well, I mentioned the deficit, and I'll re-emphasise the fact that that deficit, the amount of investment in inverted commas or growth funding, and I've spoken about this a lot. I don't like the term growth funding because I think what that funding was just to deal with the deficit. Real growth funding is extra money to get on with other areas and improve what we're doing. And so I would like to have that conversation again in terms of funding of schools. As to now we're at this baseline level and being maintained, what do we actually want to do in terms of future development? Because education is changing all of the time and schools have to adapt to that. And I think you've probably been in schools as well and you see the range of need that is being dealt with. And I am genuinely humbled by what I see happening in schools. We're going to 3 schools this week. The range of students, the range of need, the range of qualification, opportunity is being made. It's just quite remarkable.
Yeah, yes, isn't it? Just coming back to that question about the independent school funding review, do you think that's mainly, you've moved on from that now with the main points, apart from a couple of things you mentioned, or is it still very much an active consideration?
I think there are elements that are still there. I mean, I'm quite happy to take a comment if you guys want to, anything that I've missed here. I mean, I think, go on.
Broadly, the recommendations numbered about 36 different projects of varying size and scale, and those were run as a part of a change programme which had a 3-year life from March 21 through to March 24. So part of the discipline then is to make sure you close down that timescale, and most things are delivered. So you ask about phases. We're now probably in the embedding and sustaining phase. So the Minister made reference to the school funding formula. If you look back, you can see considerable progress has been made. If you look forward, you can see there's still further refinement needed. These things tend not to stop, but they're now managed in business as usual as opposed to in that project and change capacity. I guess a couple of big things that we're still working on, the Minister's referenced the review of the teachers' terms and conditions. So that's something that continues beyond the life of that programme. But there might be some other challenges ahead in terms of how we then finalise the delivery of the inclusion review, which was commissioned as part of the programme, delivered in terms of the recommendations as part of the programme, but is working its way through at the moment. But those are just some other examples of what's been delivered and what is ahead of us still.
Yeah.
And if I add, as Jonathan mentioned under the Minister, certain things that were high profile as part of the reform programme, like the funding formula, had standing groups of head teachers and experts. That's been normalised in business as usual. But other areas, one of the transformational policy options in the funding review was to focus resource over time more towards the early years. And the Minister has made that a significant priority in the CSP, which is big focus now. So a very strong part of the education reform programme is properly placed in that commitment of government.
And I'll make no qualms about it. It's a really challenging area to address because there is a need, there is a lack of provision because for all sorts of reasons, including staffing, the facilities are there but not necessarily in the right place or they've got the right people in. And we are working incredibly hard, and I had a very positive meeting, for example, with primary heads the other day who are absolutely on board about helping develop that that provision in the longer term. We've got a positive relationship, I believe, with the Jersey Early Years Association. We've stabilised the NEF funding, so we know where we're going with that. So I think we've got a good firm basis to try and move forward. We want to pilot some schemes. I've been a bit pushy in terms of piloting things quicker. The one key thing that is agreed as well is that we've been stuck, I think, and this is talking about early years and nurseries.
Well, if I can just stop you for a minute.
Because you're going to ask some questions there,
No,
sorry.
I was going to say, because we've got to focus on secondary education today.
Okay.
So maybe at the public hearing, if we can, quarterly hearing, if we can ask you more about the early years.
Deeply into it, I crack on about it too much. So.
So if I just say that a couple of questions now about the actual funding formula. You've already answered some of these questions, actually. I was going to ask about the benefits of the formula compared to the average weighted pupil unit, but you mentioned about the fluctuations and so on. And Are there any drawbacks or challenges as a result of using this formula instead of the average weighted pupil unit?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is that we have to set, whenever you set up something that is based upon, if you like, an average point for funding a class, you have to pick a part of the pay scale where you have that average amount that you'll fund in terms of staffing. And I don't think we ever have that perfect, but so therefore it currently says scale 11, I believe. So if you've got a lot of teachers at the top of that scale, you could be in, a lot of your funding, or you may be, if you have teachers over that part of the scale, you may have an issue with the amount of money that you're provided for paying staff because they're above that average that has been set. If you're below that, however, you've got an advantage. But there are some benefits that can come from that, which is to increase the range of experience within a school, for example, which is good. It means that also we are working on compensating in those areas if that does happen. But I think that's the sort of fine tuning we're talking about. Which is the best bit to pick? How can we get that to work for us the best we possibly can? It has encouraged perhaps to have some less experienced staff come in so they can gain in the same school as more experienced staff, which is good. And it gets that movement and that succession planning is the phrase I'm looking for in schools. So there are some, it's a two-sided coin
That's
with that
good,
formula.
but maybe needs a bit of refinement.
It can be a problem. The other thing is as well to get right the amounts. But I think, again, the ALPU never dealt with that problem. The ALPU would not have addressed the range of teaching scales either. In fact, I probably would have been much less refined, I would have suggested, because it was a sort of very blunt tool per pupil
So you
funding.
don't really see any other drawbacks around the new one?
Anything you want to mention?
Perhaps just by way of example, another area which I think isn't a challenge that comes with the funding formula, but an appropriate challenge. The Minister has described that part of the new formula points much more funding in a targeted way at children. So an example is children with a record of need, and the idea is to conduct the assessment to fully understand the range of needs that child has, which can be very, very varied between different children and young people, and then make the appropriate support payment to schools so they can provide the right resources. So that's all very sound conceptually. What it creates, though, is a challenge to then run a process which conducts annual reviews, which does it in a timely way, which means that in transition between, let's say, primary and secondary school, we can let head teachers know who's about to arrive in September. So there's additional machinery we need to put in place to enable us to continually provide that targeted funding. And that's a challenge, but as I say, a challenge that I think is appropriate for us to face.
So because it's more targeted, you've got more measuring involved, sort of. And
Indeed.
Okay.
Movement is, absolutely crucial.
I think one positive, though, is that there is now an inclusion component to funding, which funds SENCOs, INCOs, I think they're called. So there is a funding specifically for all schools. There's also another level, as I noticed, that gap between children who are special educational needs identified but not on a record of need. Yeah. But money has also been focused on those areas of record of need, which are real needs within a school. So it can range between 10,000 and above for funding targeted for a particular, real need for individuals. I think that's a good thing to happen.
Yeah, okay.
Because in the long term we can have an impact.
That's okay. And are there any elements of the new funding formula that are still in transition? Because I know that it's been a process, hasn't it?
Yeah.
With bits implemented.
I think the thing I mentioned about where you hit the point of the funding for staffing.
So the refinement around that.
Refinement around that. But also I think, as Jonathan said, I think it's that refinement of the definition, the development of record of need and identification, making sure that that's undertaken quickly so that the funds can be in place where they're needed. I think there's some work to do on multilingual learners. We have increasing the number of different languages spoken in schools, which is enriching for our community. We just spoke to 4 students at Holyoke, actually, who were talking about how I think it was German, I can't remember the others, Portuguese, Romanian,
Swahili.
And it was fascinating to hear them talking about how included they felt and how proud they were of that, and I think it was very, very good for the school. But that work, I think, is really important. It's important as well for people coming to the island to work, that the children also have access to their home language, so that they have that access to home as well.
That's important,
So there's
isn't
some
it?
more work to be done there, I think, in terms of the best way to use that money.
But they're
Best way
not
to do
sort of
that.
anything actually in the plan that's not been implemented yet at all. It's just sort of building on what's there, is it?
Yeah, I don't
No
think
other
there
things in
is.
transition.
So I think in terms of the schools that are receiving budget through the school funding formula, we've moved into that continual cycle of improvement, which is, Sean, the Minister reference, is now in our business as usual. So today, in fact, we had head teachers, we had central colleagues, we had treasury colleagues working on, right, what next in terms of opportunities for improvement. But it's more nuanced than it is core, I'd suggest. Perhaps our next phase of work is recognising that we still have some schools that are on the old ORPU model.
Yeah, I was going to mention that actually.
Yeah.
In fact, I will say something about that. I think it's best. So the fee paying and grant funded schools remain on the ORPU model, and they're sort of benchmarked against that ORPU as it would have been and has continued. Partly because of a piece of legislation, P41 2017, which sets the levels at 22 and 47% of the ORPU that comes from as states funding, and then the rest comes from fees. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for that to change, I believe we may have to change that legislation. But what we're doing is we'll continue that for 2025, the best that we can, the best fit that we can, and then talk about how that may fit into our new funding model from 2026.
Okay.
So they are ongoing discussions, and we want to just make sure it works in that format.
So the intention is to change, to bring them into
If it's the
fund-
right thing to do, then yes.
Okay.
And I will say that quite clearly, if it's the right thing to do. I think we need to be realistic about that.
Okay, and has CYPES received any feedback about the formula? And you've already mentioned about the discussions in the schools and so on. But, do head teachers, have they told you what they actually think about the formula and how?
I've had direct discussions and asked them the question, what do you think of the formula? But when we've talked to head teachers, I think they're happier in terms of the level of funding. In many ways, they'll always ask for more funding. Of course they would. I always would. I think we all would. But I think it's brought a bit of stability to funding models, so head teachers know where they are. So I think there have been positives that have come from it. But again, as we continue to develop and the nuances and the subtleties of that, we will find where there are gaps and fix them, I would suggest.
You don't have any formal consultation feedback?
In the meetings, you would have.
Yes.
We have half-termly structured meetings with a wide group of individuals, including teachers, head teachers and primary and secondary, special schools, central departments, under terms of reference, where the ambition is that group owns the continuous improvement of the formula, and the output in terms of proposals for change would feed into Sean as Group Director as part of the normal budget management cycle.
Okay, so
And there's also been some work recently on the completion of record of needs and the best way to do that and to speed that process up, which is really important. And I think when pupil premium, and I'll say this and probably was first introduced, I think the notion of how that money would be spent and directed had to be developed. 5 or 6 years in, I think that is much better now. So it doesn't necessarily have to be spent on an individual student. It can be put together to address needs of a few students together or a class of students. So I think I sense that is being more effectively spent. But that's because you get used to what you're doing, I suppose. Yeah.
okay, I just want to ask you about that there were those funding deficits before, and about how this works. So the previous two government plans have sought additional revenue funding for demographic changes and investment in frontline services in CYPES. We were wondering about the process. So how has this worked out that links the funding formula calculations and the requests for additional funding that was sought through government plan processes?
That additional funding in the previous years was really additional funding to sort out the deficit and to get, I believe, schools back up to a point where they were not running at deficits. And if I mean, I've got some figures here from 2021 and so on, which just about every school was running at a deficit. When that funding was obtained, it got schools back to a level where they are functioning, are reasonable, not at a deficit, let's put it simply like that. The funding formula then can help maintain that where they are. What we have to do moving forward, I think, is think about what else do we want to do in our schools, what else is needed, and what else might need to be spent in order to get those developments going. And that, I think, would be part of the government plan process. This government plan is slightly different because of the emphasis that we put on a sort of made smaller CSP, so because we've got 2 years of focus.
Yeah.
But that's where the emphasis on nurseries comes from. But the lifelong learning remit on that will also certainly address schools.
And just as we try to understand the process in a bit more depth, I mean, so I see what you mean about address the deficits before, but how does the financial year, how's that aligned with the academic year? How does this actually work? How does it happen?
In terms of, yeah, because we're January to December, whereas the academic year is September, so it's always been a problem in schools, that, by the way.
I can imagine.
It's a problem in the UK because their years from April till April and schools are September to September. Effectively, and do you want to, I mean, I don't know how we put those two together. We effectively know what the funding would be from September to September. Go for January, we'll know where we are in December, and we'll know what was needed in the following year.
Yes.
So we just sort of, how can I describe that?
So when we now have a smaller proportion of the school funding based on the pupil numbers, but there's a census of pupils, not only the actual broad numbers, but also their needs mix that runs in the autumn term and the spring term. So we take the autumn term census and set the budget for the following calendar year on the autumn census, but we retain some money in reserve and make an adjustment as we come into the September term. So in that way, the financial accounts run January to December, but from the school's point of view, there is a recognition that their whole landscape changes in September, and that's prorated. The funding formula itself allocates the available funding in the fairest way based on this concept, what would you have in a model school? It can't make extra money, but what it does is it allows us to have a model there, and with all the expert advice that we've got, the model school would cost 2 or 3% in any 1 year more than we have available, but we can only distribute what we've got. So it allows us to continue to model what should happen and put that forward in business cases going forward, but it also then allows us to allocate what we get as fairly as possible once we know the outcome. So that's how those two things
Thank
come
you.
together.
So
for that
effectively, a bit of money is kept aside for September as a best estimate, which comes from the evidence previously.
And as a practical example, you'll be aware, and the panel's focused on secondary school funding, the bulge of children has been going through secondary schools. So last academic year, one of our schools went up from 7 forms of entry to 8 forms of entry in September. So the autumn census plans for that increased number for the next calendar year, but we've held money back so that we were able to resource the school.
Yeah, that's a good description. That's clear.
My last question on this is, do you expect there will be additional revenue bids in the next government plan, which are linked to the funding formula?
What we want to do is target them towards the CSP priorities, which we'll have. We want to make sure that we're maintaining where we are in schools, and that's working. I think we do have some stability now. I think it will help that we do have some stability going forward, and we know numbers and where we are. But if there are to be bids, they will be towards specific areas, of which we haven't decided on yet, to be quite frank, apart from the CSP areas. One of the areas will be in the lifelong learning remit, and that will include schools and colleges, but certainly we had a very good meeting earlier regards apprenticeships, for example, and we need to look at the way in which we develop those. And they are relevant to schools because that's where students are going, or it's where they're starting apprenticeships, and the nature of the education they'll receive. So there will be some areas targeted towards that, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Yes, yes.
It is I, Minister, everyone. I'd like to talk to you about the fiscal deficits that you mentioned before. The Independent School Funding Review had found that there was a fiscal deficit, we've already mentioned those, of 2.4 million, of which 2.06 million was attributable to secondary schools. Has the funding formula resolved the problem of the deficits?
I think the input of money for 2 years solved that problem. Stop me if I'm wrong, but I believe that is the case. We are now at a point where that deficit was removed and the funding formula, I think, is more appropriately funding money. So it may not have, it's resolved the deficit that existed, but I don't want to say it's going to be perfect into the future because I don't want to give up my possible future aims for more money. So that's one reason. But also the funding formula, I think, is being embedded to see how effective it will be. If we come to a point where we recognise that even with the funding formula, even with the targeting of money that we have, there start to arise deficits again, then we need to look at it again. But I think the key is that with a formula that has got these nuances built in, that should be easier to do. Because you either address one area of it, so the average amount of money given to classes, it could be where we position the scale in terms of teaching, it could be in the area of inclusion component, it could be in the area of previous attainment. So because there are these elements of it, I think it would be easier to target, to find out where the issues are. So for example, and that is a really good example, if we find that there are serious areas for those with prior learning,
No prior attainment.
low prior attainment, and we're recognising that schools with high levels of low prior attainment are hitting deficits, it may be one of the reasons why, and that's what we can target. So it should be easier, if there is a deficit, to solve is probably a better word, that deficit with this formula than the rigid OPU formula. But I hope that we can get to a stage of funding where we don't have deficits, and then we start to look at how we can develop and really target to develop the impact of our funding in schools.
Sure. We were provided some very good figures in 22 that still had a deficit across the secondary schools, which is what we're talking about today, of approximately about £40,000, but that this was spread across a smaller number of schools. What can you tell us about the financial position of secondary schools for the year 23 and the year to date in 24? Has that situation changed?
I believe it's improved. We have figures for 23, 24. I've got a page here somewhere.
9.
Well, it's early on, isn't it? This is the table of, there's certainly been an improvement with regards to the deficits that existed. Sorry, I've got so many pages here we've prepared, I can't find.
I'm very impressed with your tab system, by the way.
Yes, I've got to give credit for one of the officers who did this. She did a fantastic job. So your question was about where are we with the deficits? Got it. Okay. There has been absolutely there's been an improvement. I mean, we were seeing deficits in schools. In this year, I think there are small deficits in some schools, but most are on target, which is a good thing to see. And I think that, again, those small deficits will be for specific reasons. And it may well be because of a particular intake that year which needed greater need, which we can then identify. And that's one of the things about I'm seeing from the funding formula. It gives us a bit of flexibility and the ability to adapt quickly. But they're certainly in a better position than they were. So, for example, deficits of 266,000 are not appearing this year, which is good.
Did you see any overruns of budget?
I would say that every single school would say there's no way we have an overrun of budget. That's just money that we've got allocated for something, and I would not be surprised at all. And in my experience of being a head of department, I would never ever have had an overrun of budget. It would always been spot on to zero, and I would expect that. But the figures are very small: £10,000, £11,000, and that may well be due to a purchase that hasn't arrived yet. And that's where the year thing kicks in, January to February, when schools are in from September, because they can order in the UK and it not be paid. And that's about, what's it called, reconciliation is the word I'm looking for at the end of the year.
What the panel would like, if it's possible, would be to provide us with written details of the year-end finances for the secondary schools for 23
Okay.
and the budgets for 24. It's just that we're now working on 2-year-old figures, so it'd be good if we had an update.
We've got the budget, but not the outturn on that, so that was the original thing that we sent out.
Okay, but we can do that, yeah,
I'll
absolutely.
just send that to you. So you want outturn 23
Yeah.
and year-to-date budgets 24?
Yeah.
Secondary schools only?
Yeah.
It'd just be good to have an up-to-date, because for our review.
Yeah.
The year-to-date budget to 24, remember, September is a significantly expensive time going up to the December.
It's usually, we profile there to be more budget available in the autumn term, because that's when schools are setting up, getting to grips with their new
And also the
cohort
terms are
and setting
longer.
up, and the term is longer.
There's more days spent. They're not equal terms frequently.
I'm
If
sure
you would-
thank you for pointing that out. The Independent School Funding Review described the double funding of Key Stage 4, and it suggested a policy adoption of consolidating academic selection at age 16. Can you describe any work that has been done to review that policy option?
I've not inherited work that's been undertaken on that. I think it was looked at, and I think it was considered to be not something that would be discussed at the moment. I think it's something we do need to address. I think the world is changing, our academic need is changing, the need for provision post-16 to be more joined up is changing. But the way to do this is to not get into the issue of, oh, this is sudden change for the sake of it, and this is, all the controversy around that, but to have an intelligent, reasoned look at where we are, bring the schools on board and say, what is the best way forward? Yes, I think the independent funding referral referred to the 14 plus costing around 700,000 or £1 million a year because of the double funding. The problem we've got is if you don't double fund and there are a lot of students change, it can have significant effects on the budget of a school, and that limits the courses available. Now, the school funding formula might address that a little if there are small numbers transferring, but those numbers fluctuate each year for a myriad of reasons. But I think that's a discussion that at some point needs to be had, that difficult discussion as to what we want to do. But any change, I think, will take a few years to embed.
I think where we are, Minister, if I may, is that the funding formula has stabilised the negative impact on the 11 to 16 schools. It hasn't, there's policy work that needs to be done in the next term, because it's not the Minister's priority in this term, to see if we could actually make the system more efficient. So where we are is it's no longer destabilising Morocco and Grainville, etc., because the funding formula has meant that the amount of money that moves with the student who moves to Holia is much smaller. It's based on a whole class worth rather than an individual person. But
this is a very important part of our review, and this is the sort of drill down that we'll need. And what is your assessment of the double funding of Key Stage 4?
It was necessary for schools, and we had the ILPU certainly, otherwise it would have really had a detrimental effect on 11 to 16 schools. The funding formula has been suggested has helped with that a lot, but I think we need to maintain whatever is necessary so that those schools are not affected by that transfer. There are lots and lots of students who remain in their 11 to 16 schools who are incredibly successful, are working really hard, who need the range of curricula that is offered elsewhere, and they are offering that, and those schools are very proud to do that, and quite rightly, and they are excellent 11 to 16 schools.
Does the government have any plans to review or change the system of selection at 14 plus, or for Jersey students or at provided schools in the future?
We've got 2 years, and in that 2 years, we have some priorities that are really important in terms of nurseries, lifelong learning, and the embedding school meals, etc., etc. I think I would like to start the dialogue before the next election, and I think it's important to start the dialogue because we are in a changing world. I think people are recognising that if we're genuinely going to train for our island, if we're going to provide the range of qualifications that are now existing elsewhere, we have to be more flexible in what we do. And whether the transfer at 14 or not is the best way to do that is something that we need to get an agreed position on across the island. Because I know it's a controversial topic for many, because it's traditionally what we do. But education does change over time. Look at the qualifications that are coming through. There's just been a change in government in the UK, which may affect whether or not BTEC exists still. It was being lost. It may well not be now.
Yeah.
T-levels may not exist. They've not had a good press recently in the last few days. So there are really changing environment in our education system and our qualifications. We can't just sit still and ignore it. We need to look at that and have that discussion.
Are you aware of any other jurisdictions in the world that has the 14 plus transfer?
Some in Northern Ireland used to have it. I don't know if they still have it. At 14, I'm not sure at all.
There is a academic selective system, not necessarily age 14.
But
In Northern Ireland.
Because as I said, our review is.
It is a uniquely, I believe it is quite a unique Jersey thing.
Yeah.
And see, part of it as well, and this is a context I think people need to step back and look at sort of dispassionately and say, it used to be the stage that at 14 you went on and you did GCSE and that was it. Many schools start GCSE preparation in year 9 now. It start that exposure to exams in year 9. They may have their English finished, for example, by the end of year 10 to give them a greater range of qualification that they can access, so they can have greater range access to post-16 education and level 3 education, which is great. It's giving our students more flexibility. Whether the rigid model of transferring at 14 will fit forever, we do not know. Many schools do start in year 9 now. And those are the type of things we're going to have to look back at and say, okay, what works? But what we need to do is ensure that we raise the standard of all of our schools, and we also provide for those who struggle at school. And that's one of the things we're trying to do in terms of, for example, the priority of trying to develop the pastoral secondary school, which is much needed. So there's a whole number of pieces to the jigsaw, but we need to dispassionately sometimes sit back and have an intelligent, informed debate on this, come to some conclusions. Not everyone will be happy, but I think the outcomes could be really good for our young people.
Has the government or department any evidence to assess whether this system of selection is the optimum way to structure secondary education?
I don't think we have that evidence, no.
There hasn't been detailed focus work under the ministers recently or currently on this area, but as well as recommending the consolidation of selection at 16 rather than 14 and 16, the independent funding review also urged the department to have a root and branch review of inclusion. We conducted that. We've reported to the scrutiny panel on the findings of the Nason report that was published in December 2021, and that shone a light on selection across the system and gave us quite a detailed evidence base, because as well as selection at 14 that's academic, Jersey has selection at 5, at 7, at 11, 14, 16, it has selection by gender, by ability to pay, by faith, as well as by academic ability. So we've got some of the research evidence, but as a policy consideration, that hasn't come up yet.
And I think what you've summed up there is exactly the pieces of the jigsaw that we're talking about. And in order to come up with any change and any addressing of whether or not it's successful, we do need to step back and have, as I've said before, a really intelligent look at where we are. If you make it evidence-based, and I agree, we do need that evidence, I think that becomes a much easier thing to do if we do want change. Many choose not to transfer at 14. They're happy in the school that they're in, they're succeeding, they've got their friends there. Others may want to be for different reasons. We need to address all of those issues before we move forward, and we need to look at the implications of any change for all of our school community. And I agree with what Sean had said there about the inclusion model. That needs to be working. We need to get that right. Inclusion doesn't mean that everyone just goes to school where they're told to go, even if there isn't the provision there. We need to make sure there's provision there.
It's, how significant a factor do you think is the history and past context of secondary education?
There's no denying that there is a history, and there's a lot of tradition in our school system, both in terms of the schools themselves, in terms of the selection process, in terms of the way that we see schools. Parents do things in a particular way, they want their children to do the same thing. What's changing, though, is the context in which their children are learning. And the world in which they're living in, be it a digital world, be it the needs of the island, be it the skills that they need, and the ever-going changing skills they need. As adults, we're constantly pushed to change our skills. You know, you have career changes throughout your life, and that will happen.
Thank you.
So whether that tradition fits is one of the questions we need to ask.
Indeed.
Right.
Okay, so Minister, with reference to the introduction in 2023 of specific inclusion funding through the Jersey funding formula, please could you detail what this money provides in a secondary school?
Yeah, I can. So the inclusion, are you talking about the inclusion component now? Yeah. So that will provide, as I mentioned this before, but it'd be nice to talk about this so that it's in its own little area. It includes resourcing for special educational needs coordinators, educational needs coordinators, other areas. If you can give me the page of that, it'd be good. So that type of areas. It also includes counsellors in every school. In primary schools, it's a part-time counsellor, and in secondary schools, it'll be a full-time counsellor. Areas of student wellbeing, including SA points, those responsibility points to coordinate wellbeing. In fact, I was at Holier School just before this hearing. We spoke to the panel there. It was the wellbeing panel that had been facilitated by member of staff, and I'll give them a shout out. They were absolutely fantastic, and the work they were doing in their school was really, really good. Yeah, okay, brilliant. So it's also, this is in very small print, so that's not going to help me. I know off the top of my head. So perhaps to do with age, I don't know. But also it's the gap between special educational needs and RONs. So there's a per pupil funding for SEN. And then there's I think the really important thing that's happened, Deputy, regards the funding is around the record of need. Because I think what's happened before is there was increased funding, but it wasn't significantly increased. So you had a scale of need. Some could be really quite significant, and it sounds clinical, but I don't mean it this way, but it's very expensive to provide that need. We should be providing that need. Don't get me wrong, it's the right thing to do. The record of need process recognises that. And what's the maximum amount for a record of need that could be paid? Around £25,000?
It's very high, I need to look up.
And that didn't
36.
£36,000.
Page
That's a
27.
significant area of funding to enable the child to access education. And that's a huge change in terms of educational need. There's also the
If it's helpful, Minister, that's for band G, the highest band, but there is a band H that says for unique needs of an individual pupil to fully incorporate them in a school, there'd be a bespoke funding that doesn't actually have a limit.
That would be for
It's
very
unlimited.
few
It would be
children, I
very
suppose,
few. In
wouldn't
fact,
it? Yeah.
the higher EFG, there'd be very few pupils in those bands.
But I think, though, it's really important to recognise, there may be very few, but it's been recognised.
Yeah.
And so those few children who perhaps before would not have accessed education,
Indeed.
perhaps now they can because it's been recognised and the funding's there. That's quite important.
Okay.
There's also Jersey Premium. There's a lower prior attainment money that I've talked about before as well. I think I've covered everything there.
Yes, thank you, Minister. So would you think it's fair to say that the inclusion budget includes funding for all staff training about additional needs to students, Or would this be met from a separate training budget?
I think it's a combination of both. I think the Senkos, for example, would receive training and then would use that in order to upskill staff is one of the models. Whether that's the most successful approach or not, I don't know.
Well, absolutely, Minister's absolutely right. The education reform programme had a discrete CPD line of significant resource, a seven-figure sum
Yeah.
recurring. So as well as money, as your question rightly asks, in the inclusion budget for the dedicated roles the Minister talked to of Senkos, of emotional literacy support assistants, of DSLs and the like, we've been able to run master's degree qualifications. We've just had the third cohort of Senkos, so all the Senkos of the island, irrespective of school type, they will all be meeting the needs of Jersey children with needs. So we've been able to fund those well. And that, having trained all the Senkos of the island, that's now moving to a formally recognised national professional qualification. Will be recurring for any new entries.
Okay.
I think there is, though, a need to, and I think it's a really good question that you asked, because I think there is a need to recognise that the training that is required for ongoing professional development for staff in these areas must be satisfied as well, because day-to-day work in those areas is vital if we're going to enable staff to be equipped with the skills they need.
Thank you, Minister. On that note, can I ask you if you can please clarify whether all the staff in the school would receive inclusion training or training about how to interact with individuals with additional needs, such as autism or ADHD, or would it be that training would only be offered to specialists and specific staff?
In a strange way, it's a combination of both. Mainly the specific staff that we talk about would certainly need to receive that training. I would want and hope that there are wider areas of training for staff in terms of, for example, autism and specific areas that come up. I wouldn't say that all staff are trained to the level of a Senko. That would be really, really difficult. However, I think that's exactly the type of ongoing professional development that would be required. I mean, if you look at models around the world, we always talk about Finland, but they do massively train their staff, and all of them are very, very highly qualified. But they also pay a lot more tax than we do and put a lot more funds into their education system. Now, I'm quite happy to take a lot more funds in order to enable that happening.
This is something that's been brought to us by parents who are saying that, you know, the specially qualified teachers, the Senkos and that, really know about this, but there are other teachers in the school who are treating their child as badly behaved and so on. And
Yeah, and I think
because they think they don't know.
I think there is a role of the Senko in order to increase that understanding.
So that it's not, all the staff don't get training at the moment. Then.
Not formal training in that directly. No, they don't. And to be quite frank, how we would depends what you mean by training. If it's about identification, I think what staff will do should be doing is using the resources that are there within the school bank, those who have been trained, to say, look, if this is not the way to do this, then let's model the way it is and learn as well.
I suppose what I was thinking of is that, like in the care sector, for example, every member of staff gets training about different conditions and so on. And some, of course, get a lot more training.
Yeah.
But they all get training.
I mean, ideally, yes, that would be exactly what's happening. You've got to remember as well that sometimes if you teach 5 classes a day of 25 students, that's 125 students you see every day. You could see, 800 students in the week. And there are many, many, many different areas there. So I think, it's a question of amassing training as you go so that staff are... We have specialist Senkos who are there to coordinate and there to ensure that within a school, the best practice is happening where it can be. It doesn't mean it's always going to be got right, and we've got to recognise that sometimes it won't be perfect, but that's that learning, and the learning, and that can improve then. But they do have a specialist role in ensuring that happens in schools. That's
so it's fair to say that the budget for training is being used primarily to specialised staff who have direct
in terms of inclusion training. Yes.
Okay.
Remember, there's a wider training need as well, and updates to the curriculum, updates to processes, etc.
Okay, so Minister, has the element of inclusion-based funding been altered since it was introduced in 2023?
You mean the amount?
Yes.
Since it was introduced in 2020, I think only by inflation.
There's been some inflationary impacts linked to pay awards. That would be net nil, though, in terms of impact on budget because the costs go up by a commensurate amount.
Yeah.
There have been some changes to the underlying level of funding for different levels of record of need, as the Minister expressed. That we also look at the change in context of a school, that's a need profile. So if we have some schools that have got increasing needs, we have 2 or 3 examples of schools that have new additional resource provisions, they would then get an increase in their budget to provide for that. So those examples are part of that continuous improvement of the funding formula, or in this case, the inclusion component of the funding formula.
So it is changing?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Changing and increasing
Okay.
in most parts.
In the 2024 government plan, the line that you mentioned earlier that says funding for various priorities, 1 million of that went to inclusion generally, but primarily into La Sante and La Passerelle, which provides specialist places. Some of them are secondary and still doesn't quite cover it. But what that does is it allows secondary schools to pupils to have something very intense and specialist input in those specialist environments, and some of them go back and some of them remain. So that was where the big additional money went in 24.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it is constantly being adjusted
You can
to
see how
provide for the
detailed it
needs.
all is, but yes.
Okay, so the funding formula presently is not applicable to fee-paying secondary schools such as Victoria College and Jersey College. Please can you outline the reasons why the same formula cannot be applied to those schools?
As I mentioned before, partly because of P41 2017, which sets the amount that is given to the fee-paying schools as part of the ALPU. So they would need to move away from the ALPU formulae in order to change that. Whether they want to do that is another question, so we would have to change that. The reason it's being maintained as it is because I think the complexity of changing that to school funding formula and then working out what percentage, if that's possible, of that will go, has been very difficult, and I think we need to embed the funding formula first. But those discussions will happen. The other thing is as well, we need to remember that the funding formula recognises greater need. So some schools, for example, would have a significant number of students with special educational needs or on RONs. That may be or may not be. We need to look very carefully at the fee-paying schools as to whether that would be beneficial to them or not, because some of that funding would not go that way, others might. However, there has been money given for SENCOs for those schools, so they have been including some of the inclusion money in addition to the ALPU, and I'm confident that the amount of money given has kept at the percentages on P41 over the last few years.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Forgive me if you have already mentioned the answer to the question I'm going to ask, but could you specifically tell us what is the long-term plan for calculating the funding for the fee-paying schools?
The long-term plan is for next year to continue with the ALPU as we are. And then as we head towards 2026, there needs to be formal discussion as to the best way. It may be that we will continue the ALPU for another year after that as the other things are developed, which may be a sensible thing to do, because I think in schools you need to know what the funding is for 2 years and you can work it out. If you've only got a year and then there's a sudden change, I think it could be difficult, but we have to see how we go. But those discussions need to happen, and we need to model what the change would look like for those schools and where they are. And that's the same for the fee-paying schools and the grant-funded schools.
Mm-hmm. Do fee-paying schools receive any additional funding for inclusion support?
They do for SENCO, I believe. But because the numbers access to the Senko may be lower. It may be that they have to share a Senko between two schools. I think that's, I believe that is the case in terms of funding. But yes, they do in those terms, yes.
And what's the specific differences between those fundings?
What do you mean? Sorry.
In terms of the funding provided for inclusion support to students, you did mention Senko does get
Yeah, that's-
additional funding.
That's a general piece
Yeah.
of funding so they can employ a Senko for their school, so they've got a specific role regarding special educational needs. That's correct, isn't it, Jonathan?
Yes, there are other components. For example, if a child with a record of need is attending one of those schools, the school will receive 100% of the base and the top-up funding. We've also been in a position to remove some long-standing charges, which have been quite significant, and then requested that the head teacher take that additional disposable income and invest that in furtherance of their inclusion.
So these are the specific differences.
So those are some specific additions, but as the Minister rightly points out, the potential change would come from adopting something that looked more like the standard formula, which is part of our 2026 discussions.
Thank you. Yes.
For those the long-standing charges that you mentioned that were removed, is that about charges for using some of the facilities?
Yes, the
Yes.
occupancy charge.
Yeah, okay, because I
So the occupancy charge was removed, and it was said, so therefore we would say that money therefore is available for you to spend on your special needs provision. And I'm being very careful as to the way I word this, because I'm not saying that children at the fee-paying schools don't have additional needs. They will do, because
I
every
expect
child.
probably just the same as anywhere else, really.
Well,
But,
it
well,
may be.
certainly for autism.
Yeah.
But just asking you about the Senko again, so there's only provision for one between two schools, is that right?
I need to double check the detail. I think we provide funding for Senko using the ORPU methodology still.
Yeah.
It's that 47, 22% for all those 4 schools.
I think it would be interesting to see how many students would, meet that SEN criteria in those schools. And I think we do have some data on that, and it is lower. It is significantly
For
lower.
the,
It would be good to pass it on if you can. Okay, you done? Okay, so the funding provided by government to JCG and Victoria College was reduced in 2022 and 23. Is there sufficient transparency about how the fee-paying schools are funded and supported by government?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay.
It does reach the 27%, 47%. And I will say as well that there is a proportion of money given to the fee-paying schools, but per pupil and the amount of money that is available per student in those schools is higher than the non-fee-paying schools still, and I suppose that's what parents pay for. So I am confident that they reach the percentages that P41 suggests of 22 and 47% of the ORPU, and that hasn't changed, and we're still there. What will happen if we change the formula will have to be discussed, and we'll have to know precisely what the impact of that is. But there needs to be clarity everywhere regards that, and that needs to be understood by the schools, by the department, by boards of governors, for example, so that we can have positive discussions about where we are with funding and know precisely what that actually means for those schools.
And the absolute funding, the pound funding has gone up every year.
Yes, not
Yes,
down.
Do you want me to send that to you as well?
would be good.
Yeah, we will send that.
Thank you.
I think it's important that that's understood.
Yes. So can you please clarify whether fee-paying schools have different arrangements to the provided for schools, say for facilities, for example, the use of the Langford Sports Centre? Is it-
You'd have to talk about specific schools, I think, there. That's a really difficult question to answer, I've got to say, in terms of their different arrangements. They have access to facilities in the same way. It depends on the school if we talk about which of the fee-paying schools. So JCG, for example, would have access to, what's the centre called now?
Langford.
Langford. I don't know how to answer that question, to be honest. Just put that question again and I'll see if I can find an answer in my head.
Yes, okay. So can you clarify whether fee-paying schools have different arrangements to the provided the ones provided for schools, for facilities use charges, for example, the using of Langford Sports Centre?
Yeah, well, they aren't charged. I think it is, well, I think we'll have to put something together there because there's a
Would
lot
you?
of information there, and depending on the school, depending on the facility, depending on the timings, and if you want a comparison to the non-fee paying schools, that's equally as complex. So Holyoke has a sports facility available, so does JCG, so does Vic, it has its playing fields, etc. Bowlier certainly has a sports centre. De La Salle, I think, uses the same one. It's a really complex answer, actually.
It is, and it would be important to acknowledge Langford as a sports centre does not exist within the Sipes estate. So there are charges in the same way some schools that might use the aqua splash for swimming lessons, it would be chargeable. Hope Valley is the only provided school with a swimming pool on its site. And there's charging arrangements internally, for example, for the AstroTurf pitches. So there's a mixed arrangement around the whole school estate. Sometimes we own the sports facility, sometimes we don't.
I think we do need to send you.
Yes, if we were to send you the question, would you elaborate on it a bit more and have a bit
I think we would need to for your review because I think that's going to be quite a few pages
great.
of documentation sitting here and answering that today. I don't think
Thank
I'm going to be
you.
able to be quite frank.
Thank you. So how much information about funding is provided to families who are considering one of the fee-paying schools, for instance?
In terms of funding that comes from government, well, that's what's in the public domain.
Yes.
In terms of the fees, they will be published to the parents. In terms of what that means in comparison, then there wouldn't be really anything published in terms of, one of the fee-paying schools wouldn't be saying to a parent, we're funded 150% of per student as to what would be elsewhere. I don't think that discussion ever happens. So I don't think it's transparent in terms of those terms. I don't think they want it to be. I think it's more about what the school provides and so on and so forth. I don't think their funding formula really comes into the choice of whether the parent will go there. I don't know. But that's more statistics that we can give you in terms of where we know that they are in terms of the money that they receive from government and the money they take in fees. We do we do limit fee rises, for example. It has to be signed off by myself and they would usually be limited to inflation.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. There are significant financial grants given to Beaulieu and De La Salle secondary schools. Yeah. Is it correct that the amount of funding given is based on the AP average weight pupil unit formula?
Yes.
It is. Yeah, that remains the same as well. And that's, again, another discussion that we would need to have in terms of grant-maintained schools. I've got to say that what we've done with our funding, I think, over the years of the different types of schools is being developed in parts. And I think there is a time when we do need to have those discussions about effective ways to do that and consistent ways to undertake that funding. But yeah, it's linked to the ALPU.
Yes, so can you describe any differences to how the funding is calculated in comparison, for instance, with the JCG and Victoria College?
It's not really. I think it's just similar, isn't it? Go on.
So the running costs are done in exactly the same way. They're the secondary school is 47% of ALPU, and we have maintained that. So that formula produces the same answer for JCG as Beaulieu, and the same answer. That's exactly the same.
Why is that particular formula then, the 47%, the more suitable calculation?
That was what was decided by the States Assembly.
That was exactly what was decided in P41 2017. So we have obviously been looking at its suitability, but we haven't got to focus on that yet. That's the Minister was saying that's looking like a 2026 focus. But it has been the same, and before that it was 50%, and that was also prescribed by the states in a proposition some years back. I can't remember which one. I'd have to look for that.
I can't remember who brought the change, but it was brought in 2017.
Yeah. But what I would say is that
Deputy
the
for Brian,
grant
Special
aided,
Minister.
the private schools effectively that we give a grant to on the same basis also have to raise sufficient fees for their buildings, whereas the property holdings looks after JCG and Vic in the same way as it would look after any other state's building.
So it's the
So,
building.
so the difference is
So-
not in the payments that
No.
we give them, it's what they're paying for when they receive those and the services they provide as well. They are different, but that's partly because they have a different structure in terms of their, use the word autonomy is probably the wrong word.
Yeah.
They own their own buildings.
Yeah.
right?
So they're
Completely
responsible for
independent.
IT infrastructure, buildings, premises, facilities
Okay.
management.
Okay, thank you. We understand that the grant-aided schools received funding for students with records of need. Is that correct? And if so, is it included in their total grant or is it provided for separately?
Separately.
Yeah, it is separately. I was going to say I would double check it, but I was pretty certain that's separately. And I think that's the inclusion piece, that element of, we have to, whether they go to whether a child goes to De La Salle, Bolio, JCG, the Kennebec, whatever, if they have a record of need, that needs to be met. And I think that's important.
Yes, that's good
Run
information.
top up follows the child.
Yes.
The base funding is in the formula, whichever formula we're talking about.
Yeah.
Thank you. So on that,
Sorry, I just re-emphasise that. That's a really important point. That's a really good description. Follows the child.
yes.
Other SCN funding may be base funding that's included is more generic. And so that's why that funding will be received by those schools. Sorry, just to emphasise
So wherever
that.
the student will be, that
Yeah.
support will be there.
Yeah, it's
for-
important.
okay,
Sorry to interrupt you there.
It's important for the
Yeah.
general public to know. Thank you. So what is the long-term plan for calculating the government funding provided for the grant-aided schools?
Well, the long-term plan is to have that discussion as to how the funding formula might fit with those fee-paying and grant-aided schools. And what will come from those discussions will determine the outcomes. And I don't want to be avoiding an answer on that, but simply we don't have one yet because we have to have those discussions. And there is an enormous amount to consider in that discussion as to the effect it will have on funding because of the targeting of funding towards more identified need. So we have to think carefully about the way that's going to work in the long term. So that's where we are. It won't be, well, the discussions will probably be started, I'd imagine, next year, but the first implication of any change won't be until 2026. I don't think it will be sensible to make rapid change before then.
Thank you, Minister.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify something about the inclusion funding, which we said was for the SEN counsellors and so on. But is it all staffing, or does that cover any facilities? I know you've mentioned some training as well. Is it staffing and training or anything else like equipment or facilities?
I don't know if it's equipment. I don't think it is.
So it covers a range of things. I think the bulk, the majority of the funding is typically invested in staff, many of whom are teaching assistants.
Yeah.
And we are hugely grateful to the large number of teaching assistants, both with us now and that have joined us recently, in that that's enabled our investment to result in more support for children with additional need. A smaller amount does go into some either small changes to premises to accommodate and support children attending the school, and also a small amount goes into some resources. So, for example, we work with the speech and language therapy teams who access and provide supports in our schools. There are alternative communication devices that children who might need additional support through their communication can access. And it tends to vary based on the need. And it might be some of that record of need funding might be around a device or some software on a device. It might be that the bulk of it is around that teaching assistant support to enable that child to use that device and access a curriculum.
Okay, thank you. So it's mainly staffing, but it can be used for some facilities and so on. Okay, great. So I just ask a question now. Minister, please can you tell us about the role of head teachers in the governance of secondary school budgets?
Well, head teachers have autonomy to control their budget when it's allocated to them, and they really make the decisions on staffing and where that money is going to be allocated. They have a responsibility to balance the budget as budget holders, as anyone who is a budget holder would have. So effectively, they take the money and will determine its spend. You have to remember that the vast majority of the money is on staff.
Yeah, and there's like a set number of like deputy heads and so on, aren't there? And so they don't have a say over that, do they?
They do.
Do,
So
yeah.
the money is, there's a model school determined by this group that is now gone into BAU that we were discussing earlier, that says that a model school that is this size and shape would have this number of staff, deputies, blah, 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 blah. But that just creates a cash limit. Having created the cash limit for the model school, that's handed to the head teacher and they may do something different
So
with
they
it.
really do have autonomy about how it's spent,
Within-
once they've
within
got
a
the
limit,
funding.
yeah.
That's developed over time, so a head teacher theoretically could say, I don't need that many deputy heads, I'd rather employ a main scale teacher and a teaching assistant because I can target a particular group. And to some extent that's necessary because of the different nature of schools. And a head teacher has to react to the cohort that it has in school. It depends upon which teachers can be recruited to deliver the curriculum. Some subjects may not be able to be delivered because you simply can't find a teacher to deliver that course. So the head teachers have to have some form of autonomy. There is governance over that though, and there are regular reviews as to where budgets are. And a head teacher would be expected to flag up any issues as they go. And that communication does happen, so that there doesn't arise big issues at the end, or they shouldn't.
And
So if it's helpful to the Minister and the Chair, the two main planks of governance are both for each of our secondary school, there's a governing body
Yes.
with responsibilities in the education law, and each has its own finance subcommittee. It might be finance resources or finance staffing, it's for them to organise, but has oversight. And then the other level of governance is departmental. So every single month we meet a seniors officer, Anne and her team, Jonathan, myself, the senior advisor team will meet and look line by line at the whole education budget, internal and each school.
Yeah.
And conversations are had to support where a secondary school, for example, may have had some resignation, retirement, some more experienced teachers leave, less experienced teachers coming in. There's more latitude and they'll get professional advice on how that's best spent. But as the Minister said, the head teacher's the lead for their budget.
that's interesting. And does that also include over, like a photocopier or something? Can they also make their decisions about what they spend money on for the facilities needed in the school?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah, so that's still their choice.
Adaptation of facilities need the permission of the landlord, Jersey Property Holdings.
Right.
So we have encouraged head teachers to make sure that those plans of physical adaptations are run past the landlord to make sure that those things run smoothly and for access of the like. But yes, head teacher will have a different view on which IT technology, whether iPads or Chromebooks or, which other
Photocopying
models.
is always a controversial subject in schools. And every
We
single
hear it
business.
all the time.
Honestly, it was probably the biggest cause of contention in the school past anything else. It's funny that you picked up on photocopying.
Well, we
It
have
made me
heard
smile.
this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everywhere we go.
Outside of SIPE's constraints, there are occasionally government-wide initiatives, and if you go back to, I'm going to say 2015, 16, there was a government-wide initiative run by the Strategic Procurement Function that is currently a subset of the Treasury and Exchequer, but wasn't at the time. I think it was with Policy and Resources, I can't remember. And a contract was let for all photocopiers
We've heard about it.
everywhere, printers.
I have to declare
So
an
that's
interest that I
not
was
a-
working on that, so I have a very
many
distinct
schools
view on it.
happy.
It didn't make friends at
No,
the
you
time,
didn't,
and it
no.
hasn't. Most things settle over time, and this one clearly hasn't.
Okay, but apart from photocopies,
You
there
can
is
see it's still a
quite a
trigger
lot of
for-
autonomy. Yes?
Yeah,
It's a sort of
Yeah, absolutely.
Minister, if I may, just a
trigger
couple
for
of
anxiety.
Thank you. Just a couple of clarifying points on this. There is significant discretion. However, as has been expressed, head teachers have an obligation to deliver a balanced budget, so it's discretion within. And there are also some things which are set where there isn't discretion. So there may be some safeguarding roles that all schools must have. So some of the funding must make sure that's discharged. There may be some core inclusion roles. Money that is for a record of need for a child must be invested for the benefit of that child. So there are some things in there that have a degree of constraint, but to expand on the record of need, it might be that head teacher works with their inclusion colleague and they decide what is best for that child. So even within a set constrained element, which is RON funding must be for child with a RON, how that is spent is still subject to that head teacher's or that staff's discretion. So it's kind of gradated or graduated levels of discretion, but lots of autonomy still with head teachers.
Yes, because I'm going to have to skip a lot of questions in a minute, but just to come back to that, it was the NASON independent review of inclusive education which recommended particularly that head teachers be given more autonomy on how the budget is spent. So you think that has been done?
Yeah.
Really?
I think it's a journey.
Yeah.
Head teachers, as recent as yesterday, where the Minister met with all primary heads, meeting with secondary heads yesterday, the ambition as educators looking at other systems would be, for example, to have 3-year budgets. You could better plan, you could accrue savings for bigger projects. At the moment, as provided government schools, we are working within the published parameters of the public finance manual, which is quite right, the duty to balance a budget annually, for example. So I think the idea of autonomy over budget is a continuum where at a certain point.
That has been suggested, hasn't it?
Yeah.
A larger amount of time so they can have more control of their budget.
Yeah, that would
And a
need
long
really,
term.
that would need careful governance and guidance because we're asking head teachers to become significant business managers then, and I think they would need some help in doing that.
It's
and
not
support.
allowed by the law at the moment, so,
Is it not?
so the Public Finances Law was amended in 2019, and
Yeah.
you have annual budgets.
Okay.
Yes.
Schools have
that's-
annual budgets, I&E have annual budgets, Health Service has annual budgets, we have annual budgets.
Cyprus has an annual budget, yeah.
So
think
I understand
the
their desire,
acquisition
but
of photocopiers would trash your budget completely according to teachers.
It's desirable, the change, but the law is
It-
what you're citing now.
We'd have to
it
look-
affects everybody or nobody.
Yeah,
They can't opt out of compliance with the law.
but we'd have to, I think there are ways in which we can develop that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we did have a huge amount of questions. We haven't got much
Yes,
time
yeah.
left. We had too many questions, so we'll have to send them on to you as written. But if I skip to a couple towards the end now. Minister, do you have any views on the choice of secondary schools available in Jersey? So, for example, for some students, there is no choice of school unless they have a level of academic ability or the family is able to pay fees.
Yeah, it is difficult because we do have a very selective system, and as I mentioned earlier, we need to have a intelligent, dispassionate conversation around whether that's what we want to continue to have. Because for every winner, there will be somebody who perhaps is not a winner in that situation. However, the other thing that we do need to do is ensure that our non-selective 11 to 16 schools are of high quality, and I know that staff are working incredibly hard to do that, and our children are extremely successful in the schools. They achieve huge amounts. I'm at Grainville tomorrow. I was at Holier today. We've been to Hope Valley and Rockia. We'll visit all of this and the Kennebec. And I've been massively impressed by the young people who are in those schools. And we've had really great conversations with them, actually, and they are doing extremely well. So it may not be a choice to go to the school. I understand what you mean by that, but I would say that I think their 11 to 16 schools are providing excellent education. We can always do more. We can always do better. They need some support. I think we need to put more support in for those young people who are not accessing school. And we are planning to do that with La Passarelle Secondary School. I'm really pushing for that. And I touch wood, if we can come with some good news for you later in the year, that would be really nice for us to be able to do. So, yes, I understand that. In terms of the selective system, it has developed over time. It's been here a long time. is it the best way to do things? My genuine answer is I don't know. I think we need to think really carefully about what we want in terms of that overall, and then look very carefully at it and see where we are. But we don't want to destroy something that's successful anywhere. That doesn't help anybody.
Okay, thank you. Minister, what's your opinion of how Jersey provides funding for its education and secondary schools in comparison to other jurisdictions?
That's a really good question, and there are comparisons that can be made through the fantastically well thought through proposition to provide the classifications of functions of government, a recognition of our funding of schools compared to other comparisons. I don't know which wonderful deputy brought that to the Assembly, but that gives us a comparison. We compare, it depends where you look. If you look at places like Finland, we won't compare well because they spend an awful lot more. In terms of the UK, I think we compare reasonably well. But I think we need to look specifically at Jersey because we are such a small jurisdiction. We are the size, effectively, of one large-ish educational authority in the UK, and it might be worth us looking there. But we also, within that, have a very selective system, distinct communities, distinct issues around inequality in some areas. We have distinct areas of educational need. I think funding is improved. But I think the funding improvement, rather than being growth, was levelling. I don't want to say levelling up because that's banned now, which is good, but it was a levelling process. And we need to, as we look forward, think very, very carefully about what we want to do with education. And I would say what I've said in the Assembly, and I say all the time, we've banned the word cost in SIPES. Whenever we talk about education, we talk about it as investment because I genuinely believe that's what it is.
So do you think maybe that investment should be considered as a higher investment than?
I would always say that as Minister for Education. If I didn't sit here and say that I think we need more money, then I wouldn't be doing my role as Minister for Education. But I think that is because we can use that money to really get outcomes. What day in, day out in schools, they deliver services and education in sometimes really difficult circumstances. To how many students go to school every day? I had to figure in the top of my head.
16,000.
16,000 young people every day. That cannot be underestimated in what's going on. And, you know, staff do that every day in, day out. I want to support them in every single way that we can to do that work the most effectively we can so that the outcomes for our young people are the most effective. Because, you know, they're paying our pensions, remember, in the long term. That's a really important thing. And then the future, and young people, the future of this island, and then education is the basis for that future. So, yeah, in terms of direct comparisons, it would be interesting for us to look at that. And if we can produce something, we'll get that to you for your review. And I understand this is about a review, so we want to help as much as we possibly can.
It was done in the Independent Schools Funding Review on 2019 data, and there's a whole purchasing power parity table. And from memory, we were just under mid-table at that time, but that is 5 years ago. So
Now, isn't it?
There is the
it
recent
would be
look
nice
from
to
that-
redo it.
from the classifications of functions of government thing as well. But that does in a small island, that should work. We'll find that document for you.
So,
There was
so,
something published
Yeah, there
recently.
was, yeah.
so we'll be able to look at that again.
Yeah,
and
I just can't remember the figure off the top of my head. I apologise.
It'd be interesting to see a comparator with our Guernsey, with Isle of Man and
Yeah.
other jurisdictions of a similar type.
Yeah, the problem is you might have jurisdictions of a similar type, but you might not have education systems of a similar type, which can skew it. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. If you've got a similar
Just
size, at least.
For
Yeah.
that as well, and well, all sorts of comparisons
Yeah.
really might be handy. And that, like you say, that was there a few years ago, but there may be changes since then as well. So just, I think we're just about done. And one last question. Minister, in your opinion, does the current system of secondary education in Jersey promote equitable opportunities for all students?
Whether the
and could they
opportunities
be
are-
improved?
Whether the opportunities are equitable, I think, is under question because of the selective nature where we are, of the fact that you can access an education if you can pay, which will give more money towards those students. But what I will say is that within our 11 to 16 schools and our primary schools in particular, there is a very good standard of education. There is a good standard of opportunity for our people, which is equitable across those schools. It's very difficult to answer that question because of the very specific nature of our education system. I would like to see post-16 in particular a greater cooperation between our providers so that there is more choice for our young people. And I think schools and colleges are recognising that either down the A-level path or down the vocational path simply doesn't work anymore, and there's a desperate need for that. But our job and my job is to facilitate that, to get it working the best possible way, so that schools and colleges don't feel it's being done unto them, it's being done with them for the right reasons, because after all, those are the professionals working day in, day out, and if we don't listen to those professionals, we can make some really poor choices, and we don't want to do that.
Okay, I think we'd better draw this to a close because we've just come to our time. We do have a lot of questions still, so if we can send them to you.
Yep, great pleasure in answering, yeah.
Okay.
We do want to support any reviews. I've been there myself, and it's really important you get the information. So I hope we can provide all the information you want. We did a lot of prep on this one, so we can give you that. Yeah.
We still didn't anticipate all the questions though, did we?
No, we
Tried really
didn't.
hard.
They involve photocopy as well.
I bet they did. Okay, well, thank